Hey everyone, this is FIDE Master Kostya Kavutskiy here for Chess.com's YouTube channel, and today I wanted to revisit my series on Magnus Carlsen because I realized we didn't cover any of his games from the recent candidates tournament in London, which is of course a huge blunder on our part. In that tournament, Magnus, through a series of difficulties, ended up taking first place, earning the right to challenge Vishy Anand for the World Championship title. And I wanted to cover one of his games from that tournament, maybe one of his more exciting games of the event. So here Magnus is playing white, and his opponent is Grandmaster Alexadner Grischuk of Russia. Grischuk is, of course, a very strong player and a really serious opponent. So he chose knight of 6, which is the Berlin defense. Magnus chose to simply defend this pawn with d3. Bishop c5 was played, c3. Castles, d6, h3. These are basically standard, I guess you could say, Ruy Lopez, or more accurately, Joko Piano moves. a6, and Magnus decided to take on c6 here, giving up the bishop but doubling black's pawns. So he played rook e1, rook e8, knight bd2, and here black decided to play d5. This is a pretty interesting decision because it comes with some advantages and some disadvantages. Also possible it would have just been play a little bit slower, maybe move like h6 and bishop e6. And I'm guessing Grischuk didn't like that white could maybe play knight b3 at some point, or even just a standard knight f1 plan and bishop e3, trading off the bishops, and maybe white has a better structure here and could play for a slight positional edge, which of course Magnus loves to exploit and convert into the full point. So instead Grischuk played d5, and the drawback of this move is that after white takes, black's pawn on e5 is hanging, so they're forced to recapture with the queen. They would love to take back with the pawn, but this just loses the pawn after knight takes e5. So queen takes d5, knight b3, and bishop f8. So the position is pretty double-edged. On one hand, white has a much better pawn structure because black's pawns on the queen side are all pretty weak. But on the other hand, black has this really nice light-squared bishop, to which white has no answer to. And, this bishop has a number of good diagonals and squares to choose from, and definitely compensates black for their defect in the pawn structure. Magnus played c4, queen d6, and I should say the position is pretty close to equal, but it's more of a dynamic equality, meaning that it's not like a dead position where neither side can create a threat. It's more of a case of if both sides play really good chess, then the game will probably be drawn, but nevertheless the game is complex and exciting. So bishop e3, knight d7, controlling some squares on the queen side here, and Magnus played d4. So interesting move. He gets rid of his weakness on d3 by playing this move d4. And if e takes d4, I think he wanted to take with the queen here. Try to go into an endgame where maybe he can exploit the weakness of black's pawns, and in an endgame perhaps black's bishops wouldn't be able to create as much counterplay as if there were queens on the board. And probably white would be a tiny bit better there. Instead, Grischuk decided to play e4, which is a bit more aggressive, but gives white this nice central control here. White played knight d2, a5 was played, a4, and your Grischuk played f5. Possibly this was a mistake, maybe too aggressive, too ambitious, call it whatever you want, but the point is that black is trying to attack on the king side, but weakens his own position, in the meantime. And here Magnus played c5. Queen g6, and knight c4. So basically white is going to win this pawn on a5, but black's idea is to try and create enough counterplay on the king side that, maybe black can even take over the initiative and win the game. So here Grischuk played knight f6, and a really provocative move. He would love for Magnus to play knight e5, in which case he would respond rook takes e5, sacrificing the exchange, but getting his knight to this great d5 square and setting up a really nasty attack on the king side. For instance, f4 is a big threat now with ideas like bishop takes h3, and maybe white can get an advantage with really accurate play, but black has definitely taken the initiative here and, hasn't given up that much material. In exchange, sure, but with all the threats that black is going to have, it's definitely worth the slight material disadvantage. So Magnus instead played bishop f4. He definitely doesn't want to let go of his control over the position. Instead, he just wants to control some key squares on the king side and in the center. So knight d5 was played, queen d2, bishop e6, and now that white has sort of solidified his position, Magnus decides to take this pawn here. And this is how white is basically going to try and win the game. Take this pawn, run the a-pawn down the board, maybe take the pawn on c6, and black is really in dire straits here. They have to create counterplay, but as we'll see in the game, Grischuk was just not up to the task. So rook b8, knight e5, queen f6, and bishop h2. Just a safe move, preserving his bishop and keeping control over the dark squares on the king side. So here Grischuk decided to sacrifice the exchange. He really didn't have much of a choice here because white is just going to play knight takes c6 next move anyways. Of course, white couldn't do that on this move because of knight takes f4, queen takes, and the rook takes b2. Or maybe even black could reverse that. Maybe play rook takes b2 first, queen takes, and knight takes f4, with ideas like queen g5. And again, black has a nasty initiative on the king side. So Magnus plays it relatively safe, bishop h2, and Grischuk decides to sacrifice the exchange and try and create some threats, and hopefully wait for Magnus either to blunder, which is unlikely, or try, just to create enough counterplay to muddle the position enough and not give white time to promote their a-pawn. So Magnus played rook a b1, very reasonable move, just activating his rook. Black, of course, cannot exchange rooks as this is their most active piece. So rook a2 was played, and Magnus played queen a6, a nice defensive move. He could have played rook b8 as well, with ideas of simply queen a8 and putting pressure on this bishop, but he really calculated far with this move queen a6 and saw that black was just not able to create enough threats to save the game. So after the obvious move e3, white took, black played queen g5, and here white played rook e2. It was a really strong move and the point of queen a6. So now if black trades rooks and wins their exchange back, white is actually just in time with this move, bishop f4. Very strong in-between move, and I'm sure Magnus saw this move from before he played queen a6. And the point, of course, is to defend this pawn, win a tempo against black's queen, and after the queen moves and white takes this knight, black has no more threats on the king side, and white's ready to just promote their pawn, and probably white's just winning here. So instead, Grischuk was forced to play knight takes e3, and here another really, really strong move that just shows Magnus's class. He played knight f3, gaining a simple tempo against black's queen, but this move really makes all the difference in the world. The point is that if rook takes a2 and rook b2 defending g2 square, black can just play bishop d5, and suddenly there's not a good way for white to defend the g2 pawn. Queen e2, black just takes it because the bishop and knight are both hitting this pawn, right? So seeing that, and again, I'm 99% sure Magnus saw this position from afar. Instead, after knight takes e3, he played the move knight f3, forcing black's queen to move and getting his knight into a good defensive square. And after queen g6, Magnus traded rooks, rook b2, and now bishop d5, just queen e2 defends everything, and black is down in exchange, the a-pawn is running, and the game is more or less over, and white's going to win pretty soon. So instead, Grischuk decided to play bishop c4. Magnus played queen a5, ready to bring his queen back into the defense. Bishop d5, queen e1, threatening the knight. f4. Magnus took this pawn. Knight c2. I mean, black is pretty desperate here. They can only rely on basic tricks and cheapos, but queen f2, bishop takes f3, rook takes c2, and in this position, Grischuk decided to resign. Basically, white is up in exchange as always, and the a-pawn is just going to run down the board. Black has no way to create a serious threat on the king side here, so black decided to throw in the towel. So Magnus ultimately ended up winning the tournament in London after a dramatic last few rounds, but I'm sure all you guys are up to date on that, and we'll definitely look forward to seeing him challenge Anand later this year. Thanks a lot for listening, and I'll see you around on Chess.com.